We keep hearing about flattening the curve.
Flatten.
Flattening the curve.
In other words, reduce the number of people that die.
Flattening the curve refers specifically to slowing the spread of coronavirus. It's to avoid overwhelming our hospital systems, like in Italy, where hospitals ran out of beds following a sharp rise in cases. But looking at what other countries are doing may help better understand how to address the spread, at least for now. Let's take an example. Let's look at South Korea. They aggressively rolled out drive-through testing, ramping up to a capacity of 15,000 tests per day. The emphasis here is catching cases as early as possible, since someone could have the virus for days without showing any symptoms. After the MERS outbreak of 2015, for example, the country received broader access to information on where people were located, so contact tracing and quarantine became easier. As of now, South Korea has seen a drop in daily new cases since the beginning of March. Singapore is another country hoping to retrace the patient's movements. They typically do this within a 24-hour period so they can notify and quarantine anyone who was in contact with the person who may be infected. Singapore was also one of the first countries to ban travelers from China. Singapore has relied on past outbreak experience, the SARS crisis of 2003, to better understand how to tackle COVID-19. Another country to consider is Japan. When you look at the curve or the number of confirmed cases in total, it may seem like the virus is progressing more slowly than in other countries. They imposed restrictions on travelers from China and South Korea, temporarily closed schools until early April, and called for the ban of large gatherings in late February. It has yet to make a call, though, on the 2020 Tokyo Olympics. But some believe that for Japan, the numbers aren't as high because the country isn't testing as much as it should. Lastly, let's look at Taiwan, which also learned a lot from the 2003 SARS crisis. Taiwan is only 81 miles from China, but they banned travelers from Wuhan a few days after the outbreak started. They're also conducting regular temperature checks in schools and office buildings. And in January, they asked companies to start mass-producing face masks. They're close to being able to produce 10 million masks a day. That's for schools and medical staff. Communication was also a key factor here. The country set up the Central Epidemic Command Center to streamline communications across the country. As of March 17th, Taiwan had 77 cases of confirmed coronavirus and 1 death. And if things like drive-through testing and travel bans feel familiar, well, that's because some of those measures are being implemented here in the United States. Although it's too early to tell whether those measures are going to be effective, especially as some other countries are starting to face a second outbreak, experts hope that they will slow the spread of this global pandemic.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here. And click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.